Good morning from Brussels. My name is Steven Lokmans. I'm Director of Research here at CEPS, Center for European Policy Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome our online audience, but especially our distinguished speakers and partner CDI from Tirana for this webinar hybrid event where only speakers are in person presence. A webinar on good governance and resilience of the justice sector reform in the Western Balkans, which will take a focus on two countries in particular, those countries that are hoping to start accession negotiation soon, that have been hoping for a while now, and have been preparing in this fundamentals first area for quite a while. At CEPS, we're extremely pleased to be able to partner again with CDI, a think tank well known to us, especially for its flagship conference, the Tirana Connectivity Forum, which is creating waves far beyond the region. We're happy to welcome, as I said, a distinguished panel of speakers. Let me start with Fioralba Chapka, currently a senior expert at CDI, but previously, of course, a stint at the Ministry of Justice in Albania, quite key in the preparation of legislative acts that supported, fundamental elements in the justice sector reform, vetting process, etc. Next to her, Ardian Achkai, I always have problems with your last name, Ardian, Director of Research at CDI, and also, like Fioralba, co-author of a number of the studies that underpin the event today. And to my immediate right, His Excellency Bojan Marecic, Minister of Justice of North Macedonia. Pleasure to welcome you back to CEPS, Bojan. And last but certainly not least, indeed, Artur Metani, High Inspector of Justice of Albania. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and thank you for coming to Brussels for this event as well. Many issues on our plate. I would like to pass the floor to Elga Mitre, who sits in Tirana. Sorry, before I do that, I should of course introduce Mr. Wolfgang Nozar as well, who's Deputy Head of the Unit and Coordination Officer and Negotiator at DG NIR's Unit A2 of the European Commission, and of course we look forward to your comments on the European Commission's wider regional view and initiatives in coordinating, monitoring justice sector reform and coordinating projects in support of that. A particular member state that is engaged in the new revised enlargement methodology is, of course, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is known for always making niche funding available for contributions in key areas. And Elga, at the embassy, you are overseeing the Albe project, which has brought us here together. Can you please tell us a little bit more about it?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, and good morning to everyone that is here today with us online. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this event, and I will not shy away from considering it a special edition. I will not enter into the core of the subject to be discussed because I see some very tough competition sitting there. So I'm trying to bring some context on which the cooperation of the embassy and our partner organization CDI has been producing the fruits that are hanging low today. But first things first, let me tell you that Albe, which is the nickname of the project, stands for Al for Albania, and BE is the Albanian version for EU. So as you can imagine, innovation starts with picking names. And I can also confirm that innovation and a very new approach are not only in the name of the project. Albe has had two main components or themes. One is the connectivity, as in the Berlin process connectivity agenda, and the other one is the accession process. And both of them provide an inwards looking at the process and the institutional preparedness for the EU accession. Of course, the role of civil society in these two processes is to be an important interlocutor, and this has been interwoven in the activities throughout the implementation of Albe. As you mentioned earlier, the Netherlands is very much involved in supporting civil society to get the space and the voice it deserves to have as an actor that can do more than looking at the match from the bench. In a Dutch perspective, the civil society is a team member, and as such can play in the field and even score for the team. So this is the new approach that is slowly but steadily being embraced by all the stakeholders in Albania, for whom what sounded like Greek a couple years ago is now becoming music for the ears. I can also tell you that when we first started the project about 3 years ago, combining the Berlin process and EU integration, it all sounded very abstract. We even noticed high eyebrows when explaining it to different stakeholders. But this is typical Dutch, taking risks and keep sailing towards the lighthouse, even when it is a bit foggy. Look where we are now, 3 years later, and it has become clear that the connectivity agenda, so much pushed forward and so much promoted by the Berlin process, as well as the regional projects that are funded or are hanging there in the framework of the connectivity agenda, cannot materialize if there is no institutional connectivity, and I underline here the institutional connectivity, between all the Western Balkans 6 countries. And or if the institutional preparedness and their standards do not share a common benchmark. And all this institutional path is closely linked to extensively fit to what Western Balkans 6 countries, some more than some others, share as a common destination, the EU. The Dutch are not only good sailors or great innovators, they are strict but fair, as you said. But it's also very important that the Dutch do not give up very easily. They stay committed, they stay engaged. For them, the process is as important as the destination. So this is why this project, Albe, is another example of the Dutch approach, strict, fair, and engaged. I hope the specific experience of the judicial reform that Albania brings in the Western Balkans 6 fora will serve as a lighthouse for the other countries as well. It can be a full package, or it can be a toolkit, which can have its downside, except for its positive side, its fancy and attention grabber impact in the country. But I will better stop here and leave the experts make their case. So, Mr. Moderator, I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Elga. Very eloquent and full of analogies, of course, to Flying Dutchman and all that. But let's hope that this type of project not only inspires other countries in Southeastern Europe, the SEE6, but also other member states in putting their men, women, and money where their mouth is in support of the implementation of the revised enlargement methodology. So thank you for that. A key concept, which is no doubt music to Ardian's ears, is institutional connectivity. Perhaps you can tell us a little more, Ardian, about the findings of the research project.
Thank you very much. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here and to share this table with you guys and with Mr. Maric, with the experts, with Mr. Medame. We should do it more often. What we have found, or just to give a little bit of context about Albe, is that when we planted at least part of the judicial reform, we were not, let's say, at this time, we wanted to see how the reform was working and what were the challenges. We were listening a lot to the politicians talking about it. We were listening a lot to the EU asking, where is the big fish? I mean, in Albania, the big fish refers to the excellent cuisine that we have, for which we are notorious now, but also to the big guys that needs to be caught, the corrupt person. So everybody was waiting for the big fish, but we couldn't find any kind of, let's say, deep and meaningful discussion. So the first study that we did was to see what were the challenges of the reform, how it kind of interacted with the enlargement, all in all. The second part that we did together, Stephen, was to see how to get the best of it. And the idea is to leave aside for a moment this problem-solving approach. There are so many problems in the Balkans, but to look at what works. To look at what works and to see how we can make other examples like this. And here we use the appreciative inquiry that we just mentioned before. The third study that we are presenting now, that we have co-written with Albe, is to see how those new institutions that have been created now can be sustainable and resilient, so that we will not witness what we call right now democratic backsliding. And here I want to underline from the very beginning, and I will leave the floor to Fiorello to go a little bit more in depth, is that we want to shift the focus from the reform to the new justice institutions. The reform is a mean, the justice reform is a mean per se. We are not interested in it. What we are interested in now is that the new justice institutions that have been created and that they are operating are efficient, are accountable, are transparent, are independent, are legitimate, have all these characteristics of what we call throughput legitimacy. Basically, we have gone inside the box of the institutions to open them up and to see how they work and how they can amplify what has been done until now. So basically what we want to say now is that we want to shift the attention from the vetting. We are not interested in vetting anymore, or not as much as appears in the media. We are interested in how the new institutions can be successful and can remain successful. The idea would be, if we can, to draw some lessons learned as well about how other sectors than justice can apply good things or avoid bad things that happen in the reform, how other countries eventually can profit from it, but also how the enlargement methodology should change its approach now with Albania. And our position now that the new enlargement benchmarks should focus inside the institutions on the good governance, and also how IPA 3, the financial mechanism of the enlargement, should better tailor to the needs of the Albanian actors. And I will leave the floor now to Fiorello, but a lot of things to say for an hour and a half.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for hosting us, and of course to the MATRA project for the financial support. I'll try to be very concise in these minutes in order to give more room for discussion. I'll start where Ardian left, saying that it's time to talk less about the reform and more about the institution. And what is new in this research is that we have shifted our focus from the normative perspective to the organizational perspective. In fact, when we talk about the justice reform or the justice institution, it's perceived that they are embedded in the legal framework. They are in the cornerstone of rule of law. And probably they are mostly analyzed from this legal perspective, how they insulate the judiciary from the intervention, how these legal mechanisms that are being written in paper ensure accountability, efficiency, transparency, but somehow it is neglected that the new justice institution per se are organizations, are entities. And as entities, they do not operate in vacuum. They have some key organizational aspects which are linked to their budget, to management system, human resources. And unfortunately, so far, not much attention it is paid to the new justice institution as organization. That is why our research is basically focused more on key organizational variables of the new justice institution, their ownership, commitment, and identifying good government elements in the new justice institution. why this approach is innovative in our side and also something that needs more attention. First of all, because the justice reform so far has been mostly evaluated based on the outcomes. And when we read the outcomes of the justice reform these 5 years, there are some reasons to celebrate, but there are also some issues which were unintended consequences of the justice reform. The Constitutional Court or the High Court, which were somehow suspended for 2 years due to the vetting process, or the difficulties that first instance courts or appellate courts are having due to the lack number of judges passing the vetting, are of course difficulties the judicial system is facing so far. But in our perspective, judging the justice reform only from the outcome is a very partial picture and does not tell much about the reform. On the other hand, our perspective is not just theoretical to see the reform or to assess it, but as a policy paper, we think it is important to focus on the good governance of the justice institution. Because we're in a phase where the justice institutions now are established, but they need to gain their own value and legitimacy. The justice reform is very technocratic. Somehow it is perceived also as a EU-induced reform, which somehow lacks the legitimacy because it's not like our own merely product. But it is time that the justice institution give back values with their decision-making process. And this should be taken into consideration to see inside the justice institution, to see their managerial style, how they use the resources, to see their commitment, their transparency, and their accountability. And we coined this internal perspective within the institution as throughput legitimacy, as the quality of governance. And we need to focus at the quality of governance of the new institution. And why was the relevance, the practical relevance in here? If the focus is just on the outcomes, on performance, it may happen that we neglect the process, and at a certain moment, unethical, undemocratic, not transparent factors affect the process, and then at a certain time, this would be also reflected, compromising the outcome. And we have seen this history happening, not only inside the EU, outside the EU, but even inside the EU. And we need to be careful to understand that the process is also important. And this is not just a one-time exercise, it's a continuous exercise. That's why we need to focus more on the inside processes, on throughput legitimacy of these new institutions. And we have analyzed in our research the environment where they operated. We have some lessons I'll be happy to share in the discussion phase about the managerial aspects, about how we were focused on the legal part and not on the human resources, and this affected the work of the institution and their outcomes. But also I'll be happy to talk here to identify some of the best practices of the new justice institution in Albania that could be benchmarks for the process of evaluation or assessment of these institutions.
Thank you, Fiora. What we should keep in mind, indeed, in the case of Albania in particular, but that goes to a slightly lesser extent for the other candidate countries as well, is of course that the European Union, often in cahoots with the Americans or other like-minded countries, third countries, push very hard for sweeping reforms in these areas. In Albania, of course, we've seen a major constitutional reform, the adoption of 30 laws, bylaws, effectively radically changing the landscape, affecting the architecture of the justice sector to such an extent that it was gutted almost with a very strict application of the vetting process, leaving new holes in the interim, and also opportunities for malign forces to take advantage of that. And probably there, the preparation, while not ill-conceived, perhaps the process of justice sector reform may have been ill-prepared or badly thought through to the end to prevent those type of black holes that are currently can be observed from appearing. We can talk more about that, but in the discussion. But I would like to shift to after Metani, because you had one of these institutions that are key in this whole new machinery, and yet you had to start from scratch.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me here to have the chance of discussing with you the insights from an actor of the new justice institution. I've thought about this topic, to be frank with you, and the considerations that I'm going to make, I thought it would be better to be coming from my personal view as a lawyer, but also as a citizen who firmly believes in the fundamental values of the European Union and Europe in general, because that is the main purpose why the reform was made, to make the country more democratic, closer to rule of law, and of course respect for human rights. And in this respect, the reform came for that need. A change which in the spirit of the European Union values aims at establishing a fair balance between power, democracy, and the rule of law. The reform was one of the deepest and largest institutional and legal reforms in the country. The selected model and the degree of intervention in the justice system in Albania represents a unique case. New institutions have been established or reorganized, and compared to other Western Balkan countries, Albania can be considered as a leader of this reform process. In this context, Albania's experience with justice reform can help during the process of planning, implementing, and monitoring institutional reforms in the Western Balkan countries. Nevertheless, in this specific case, it must be taken into account the fact that the countries of the Western Balkans are at different stages of their integration processes. These countries have different legal systems and traditions as well. Despite the fact that the country's concepts or rule of law standards are the same for all European countries, it is required that the application of these standards be done in full respect for their traditions as well as their political, social, and legal context. This process should be carried out through a careful analysis of the selected model and the degree of intervention in the justice system. It should be realized through a process of experience exchange to address the challenges as well as to learn from the experience of other countries. Justice reform is in the process of being implemented in Albania. However, this process has not been easy. The complete reform of the justice system has faced several challenges while establishing and making functional the new bodies, which have had a significant impact during the initial activity of the new institutions. These experiences or challenges are the existence of an initial political will to approve it, but also the change of this will during the implementation of the reform, delays in setting up new institutions and selecting their staff, lack of infrastructure and human resources, lack of planning and budget support, lack of magistrates because of the vetting process, lack of an inter-institutional interaction strategy, the existence of technical or administrative obstacles which prevent the institutions from fully exercising their power, and others. There are different factors at the political or organizational levels which may have brought about these delays, and having analyzed them in the study that was presented here by Ms. Chaka, the conclusion that I get, the factors are the conception of this reform not based on the method of evaluative research, but according to the problem-solving method, the existence of the political vision, values, or will, the core competencies, core infrastructure, embedded knowledge, technical and financial resources, and learning processes and the strength of partners. However, most of these obstacles have been already overcome, and the new bodies are now functional and they are performing. Justice reform has entered a very important phase of its implementation. The institutions of the justice reform are fully committed to creating a system which complies with the European Union standards as well as to delivering concrete results of their work to the citizens of Albania. Now the challenge of the country, as well as the success of the implementation of justice reform, are no longer the conception and the establishment of the new institutions of justice, but their full functioning based on the principle of good governance and the rule of law. The new institutions of the justice system do not automatically function in accordance with the standards of good governance and rule of law. The concept of rule of law is a complex concept, and it makes a distinction between the formal existence of legal provisions and their implementation in practice. In this case, justice reform has built the capacity of the justice system, but achieving concrete results requires influence and changes in the judicial and political culture of the country. The European Union is based on a set of joint values, which include respect of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. These core values constitute a key asset for the EU, and their preservation or provision is a shared responsibility of all the EU institutions, as well as its member states. The EU has played a key role in designing, financing, and implementing the justice reform in Albania. The influence of the EU has served as an external stimulus to influence the process of change within our country. However, the internal change can only be made by the citizens of the country and by the institutions themselves. The EU, as well as other international partners, have played an important role in improving the quality of the justice system from a formal point of view, but this process must be accompanied by continued support by both our state institutions and the Albanian citizens in order to implement these rules and consequently achieve quality in practicing the justice system. This means that in this case, not only there is a need for a passive initiative, which can be materialized through a legislative process, but also for an active and continuous political activism in different directions, whose goal is the same, establishing the rule of law. The EU can bring about change and also affect the quality of justice system reform indirectly. The EU influence can bring changes and influence the way a reform process is implemented through the strategy of democratic conditionality according to the Copenhagen political criteria or conditionality in relation to the acquis communautaire. This process must be both political and meritocratic. On the other hand, the EU, through its transformative power, by spreading democratic values to citizens and supporting political elites who believe in the work and the values of the European Union, can establish a fair balance between powers, liberal democracy, and the state of law. The EU should provide technical assistance, as it has done since 2005, even through the Euralius mission or other forms of technical assistance. The EU can assist in the implementation of justice reform through guidance, monitoring, institution capacity building, or a range of other activities which would enable its implementation in practice. The implementation of justice reform in Albania continues. Justice reform is an obligation of the Albanian state to its citizens. This is not the time to reopen the discussion on the need for justice reform, as this fact is already proven to be necessary. But it is time to increase its efficiency, as well as taking measures for this reform to yield the results which it was conceived for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Artur. And your last words actually chime immediately with the question that was raised in the Q&A function of Zoom, which I would encourage our online audience to use in order to channel their comments and questions for our speakers. We will curate the Q&A box and make sure that those questions are posed. The question was basically, is there an end in sight? You know, when will the justice sector reform actually end? And is there an intention, you know, to end the vetting process? I suppose you've answered that question already. Is that, you know, no, this will be a continuous effort.
It's a dynamic
that will be dynamically improved and made more efficient and effective as well.
Let me just intervene here, Stephen, just for one short thing. I think that we need, and we have all agreed, and we have a discussion with this morning with some colleagues, that justice reform is not vetting. Vetting is one of the components of the justice reform that has unjustly taken so much attention. The justice reform are the new institutions. They will deliver justice. So we want to focus on the new institutions, on the good governance of the new institutions. The vetting will continue, and not only for the justice.
Good point. Thanks for clarifying that, Arjan. Bojan. turning to North Macedonia, perhaps you can lift the seal on what you have done in the past few months and years, indeed, where you see this going as a part also of the revised enlargement methodology.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's my great honor to be here. I really feel comfortable and welcome in SEPS always, and now in this new capacity. I have perfect speech written by my team, but I have decided, because of my previous life as an analyst and think tanker, to change it a bit and to make it more dynamic in order to sketch the picture, the image of what has happened in North Macedonia in the past several years, and what I think is a permanent activity on a regular basis that should take place in the future. First of all, I would like to make a remark that as a person who follows the European integration process, particularly in the area of rule of law of the Western Balkans in the past decade, let's say, I think that one of the best things that the Commission and the EU has done is to give more prominence and leverage to the topic of rule of law and judiciary over time in the process of accession. Fortunately or not, it came with lessons learned from the Western Balkans. It came from the cases of corruption in Albania. It came from the political crisis 2015-2016 in North Macedonia, when we had explosion of breach of human rights with mass wiretapping of 20,000 citizens, illegal wiretapping, influence over the judges' decisions, etc., etc. And I think that was the turning point, at least in North Macedonia, but I think broader in the region, the turning point was the engagement of the senior expert group of Reinhard Priebe for rule of law in North Macedonia. That report that they have written has been the basis, the fundament of all the reforms that we are taking over in the past 5 to 6 years. And I think it was a model that was mirrored in Albania and in other countries in the region, and that has set up this fundamentals first approach, the new approach that has come several years ago, and even more with the new methodology, the cluster fundamentals, that is the basis. It is based on this 23 and 24 starts first, finishes last, but extended, because they have realized that it's not only about the judiciary, but it is also about public procurement, it's also about public finances, and that all of it is very, very linked one to another. So I commend this, and I think we should, and I would also encourage the member states to keep the focus and to keep the light on the rule of law and on the judiciary in a broader sense over the process of accession, because it is actually crucial, and everything else can be very well adopted, very well enacted through the legislative process, but the rule of law and the judicial system is the only one that can have or let's say one of the rare that can have also a reversible process of worsening over time. What do we need for stable reforms or stable reform process, and what do we need to have a permanent reform process that will keep the heat in the judiciary and in the rule of law sector? I will speak as a Minister of Justice, having on my experience in the past several years, but also as an analyst that works on in the area of rule of law and European integration. Four aspects I would like to cover. The very important preconditions for functional or resilient judiciary and rule of law sector. So preconditions, the substance, the principles, and the actors. Speaking about the preconditions, what is very important is to provide for resources, human resources and financial resources and technical resources. This is what we are paying attention to at the moment in North Macedonia. We are increasing the budget of the judiciary for the next year, 6.5% for the judiciary, 13.5% for the public prosecutor's office, hundreds of new employments in their administration, because they always complain that they don't have clerks to help them in their job and to be more efficient, and huge process of digitalization that will make them more efficient and providing the services for the citizens easier and more practically. Active reform plan that goes together with political stability and political will. So political stability and strong political will is a precondition for successful judicial reforms. Otherwise, you cannot count on a viable reforms that will give results and that will make the judiciary resilient. So reform plan is very important, meaning to have a strategy and to have action and steps defined by the strategy that will give results, but that goes together with political will and political stability. And finally, European framework. We are doing all of this because of ourselves, because we want to bring Europe at home, because we want to be a European Union country, but we need to have an active process of negotiations if we want to produce quick results, strong results, and viable results that will not go back. So EU negotiations and EU funds are crucial for the viability and sustainability of the reforms and their irreversibility. Because if there is not this active process, there is always potential for going back in with the progress. Speaking about the substance, I think we have mentioned the legislation. In North Macedonia, we have done ostensible legislative actions, activity by the parliament in the pastoral years. We have changed law on courts, law on judicial council, law council of prosecutors, law on public prosecutor's office. We have strengthened the position of these bodies. We have strengthened their the basis for appointments and dismissals. And this is also very important part of the substance, the legislation, but it is certainly not enough. So the second thing is the track record. This is what we have been discussed with the European Union, and now we have a monitoring project for track record on 50 high-level corruption cases in the courts, which will give very good picture, very good image of how do courts handle and how prosecutors handle with the high-level corruption cases. We had special prosecutor's office, which unfortunately collapsed, but the cases are still in the court, and now the regular public prosecutor's office has taken over. So that is the biggest test of their track record, and all the legislation is tested through these specific cases, but also through the practice and through the monitoring process of these cases. Third element of the substance is the training. There are two aspects of the training that we need to take care about. One is the professional training. We have the Academy of Judges and Prosecutors, which has training, the same training of 24 months for all the candidates, and it is a single entry point in the judicial system. So you need to go through that training if you want to become a judge or a prosecutor. That means a single entry point. But what I think is also necessary, and it's still not in place, is training for the heads of the courts, and heads of the Judicial Council and the Council of Prosecutors, training on managing the institutions, because they're very good professionals in dealing with the law. They're very good legal professionals, all shutting down in 25 seconds. But they're not. They're poor managers. So they need training in managing the institutions, in managing the Judicial Council and the court, because this is a big challenge.
Can I just interrupt you? Xavier, logistical support, we may have a problem in 8, 7, 6, 5 seconds. Please come.
You want me to come upstairs?
Yeah.
Censorship.
I don't know. But hopefully,
hopefully we can continue like this. No, we cannot. Just 1 second, please, until we resolve this issue.
We'll just have to work on training.
Yeah, I know where exactly where. Okay. A couple of more minutes, so 3, let's say.
Xavier, if you could please come up to the room.
Management, as you mentioned, it's a real problem. It's a huge problem. Switch because
the technical problem is being addressed now. We should be back online in 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Be back. So Nozar, can you please indicate whether you can hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we're back live. Apologies for that short interruption, especially to you, Boyan. You were on the point of training.
Yes, I was discussing the part of the substance of the judicial resilience regarding the training. I mentioned that beside the professional training that the Academy of Judges and Prosecutors is providing, what is necessary and what I would appeal for also EU support and EU member state support is training for the management of the courts and public prosecutors' office, because we have cases in which very good lawyers, very good prosecutors and judges become presidents of courts or heads of prosecutors' office, and they manage badly. They have poor management, and this is why they cannot improve the performance or improve the efficiency of their institutions. And finally, regarding the substance is the matter of independence. I think that the issue of selection, dismissals, and responsibility is very important, because this means quality of justice. It's not only selection and dismissal. There are a lot of things in between selection and appointment and dismissal, and we think that this is actually the substance of the independence over the resilience, but the responsibility of the Judicial Council of Prosecutors must be explained better to them, because I think that they sometimes, very often, these institutions do not understand fully the responsibility they have in improving the quality of the justice. Speaking about the principles, the third branch of the resilience, I would say what is here important is transparency, responsibility, and efficient justice with high quality. What does it mean? I think what we had a challenge, and this is one of our priorities, our government's priorities in communication with the judiciary, is increasing the transparency. The judges and prosecutors, most of them, they don't feel the need to regularly inform the media and the citizens what are they doing, why are they doing that, and how they spend the public funds. This is because they're not going at elections. All of them have permanent terms, so there is no interruption in their terms, and they feel lack of responsibility. They think that being independent branch of power is enough, so no one will ask you anything. I think this is a big challenge, and this is something that we need to work on together with the judiciary, because this is the reason, one of the reasons why the judiciary has such a low support in the public opinion polls, why they have such a bad image in the public opinion polls. And I always point out as a minister to them that this is equally important, just as it is important for a member of a parliament or a minister or president of the country or prime minister. It is equally important to them to make their own fashion of transparency and responsibility and accountability in front of the media. Because when we have judicial decisions that are not popular or inexplicable, the negative points go to the government. They are pushing people are pushing the government to do something about the incorrect or disputable decisions. Finally, speaking about the actors. I think you have mentioned the role of the civil society. I couldn't agree more that it is very important and crucial. But I think what is even more important is the role of the stakeholders in the process of resilience, of the reforms and the EU-funded projects and other funded projects. We need to do more to give them ownership to all of these processes, because very often the judicial institutions are doing the projects and processes because they were told by the European Union or by some influential civil society organization like Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Committee, etc. And they very often just do the things to tick the box without getting into taking ownership over the process and bringing the process till the end. Of course, the government and the parliament have their share, but this is their responsibility to take over the process. So finally, the bottom line of all of this is to have a strict and fair process. I think it is strict enough, and it can get stricter, but it should also become more fair, because now Albania and North Macedonia have seen more strict than fair. we strongly believe that we will start the negotiations as soon as possible, so we can have both strict and fair at the same time. And I would just disagree on one point with Arthur. All the countries in the Western Balkans have their own systems and their own specificities, but they are all comparable. And we should make comparisons between the countries, because this is how we're going to get some lessons learned from the experiences of other countries. And as a policymaker now, I can tell you that it is very useful for us to hear the aspects of the vetting, positive and negative, to hear the aspects of other actions in other countries. And I can tell you it is very useful for policymaking process. Thank you.
No, I agree. I agree with the last at the end. This is what I meant actually. Probably.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, thanks for extrapolating this a little bit. Indeed, you mentioned a preview report, and it's and as a source of inspiration, of course, for other countries in the region as well. You touched upon certain aspects of the revised enlargement methodology, which could be applied, of course, to rule of law in particular. I mean, if this is, the beginning and the end, basically, of the process, should it be mainstreamed, perhaps also in some of the other clusters, than the fundamental one to which, chapters 23 and 24 belong. You mentioned the issue of reversibility, which is potentially problematic in terms of political decision making within the Council of the EU. An issue we touched upon in the previous debate as well. But with that extrapolation, I think we're keen to hear from Wolfgang Nozar at DG NIR, the more general approach in this particular sector towards the Southeast European Six.
Thank you very much. Allow me to start maybe with a few general observations on our policy, and also react to a few comments of the other speakers. So, as a very general observation, judicial reform, or establishing a functioning and independent and accountable judicial system, has been a requirement for EU accession for a very long time. It is already spelled out in the Copenhagen criteria. So when people say we are focusing more on this, we are not changing the conditionality, but we have just realized that establishing such a functioning system takes a long time, because these systems exist. There are lots of national traditions. There are things that have been there for a very long time. You need strong political will of all actors. So because this is such a complex endeavor, and because it takes such a long time, we have already started with Montenegro and Serbia to bring the key rule of law chapters 23 and 24 forward in the accession process, start early on and finish at the end, so to give the countries enough time to really implement these complex reforms. With the revised enlargement methodology, we have been even more strict by saying the fundamentals cluster has to be opened first, and it will be closed last. And the interim benchmarks are a key element to determine also speed on other clusters. So it's not an isolated cluster, but it closely interacts with the other clusters and therefore determines the overall speed of the negotiations. The core element for all these reforms from the Commission perspective is, of course, that these are not our reforms. These are reformed by the countries. They have to own these reforms. They have to make them work in their national system. And therefore, we are not imposing one specific approach, but we want the countries to do what is best for them and what makes their system work. This is why already with Montenegro and Serbia, we ask the countries to adopt action plans at the beginning of the accession negotiations. And we will do something similar for Albania and North Macedonia. Ask them to adopt roadmaps where they structure how they want to implement these reforms, how to make it work. So this is really a key message from my side, that the countries need to own these reforms. From the Commission perspective, we are of course ready to support all these reforms, and we have a number of different tools. I mean, on the one side, we have policy tools. We try to provide guidance and recommendations, You can see this in the annual enlargement package and the different country reports, but also in our dialogue with the authorities, we provide these recommendations, but it's still up to the countries to implement them. Then in parallel, we have, of course, our financial assistance. It was already mentioned. I mean, just under IPA 2, which ran from 2014 to 2020, we have spent more than 400 million euros for justice reform, including through regional programs, but also national programs. So there is quite a big investment from our side. And under IPA 3, we will, of course, continue this strong investment in the rule of law and judicial systems in particular. We have a slight change in IPA 3. We will not have these national envelopes anymore, but we will focus on thematic envelopes. But this doesn't mean that we will reduce our funding. It just means that we will have more of a focus on the most important thematic issues. But at the same time, we also will make sure that nobody is left behind and there is a fair share principle when we implement this IPA 3. Now, under IPA, we have, again, a broad range of things we can do. I mean, we can invest in the legal framework, physical and institutional framework, including buildings. We can do capacity building. We can provide technical assistance, trainings, workshops, seminars. We could contribute to networking. We have invested a lot in IT systems in the different countries, which I think is an important part to make the judiciary also fit for the future, especially at this core point in time when there is this big reform. I think you don't have to follow what the member states have done over 10, 20 years. I think you should really focus on what is the best available system now. Then, of course, indicators are a key element. We want to know how the judiciary functions. And here I slightly disagree. I think outcomes are important, and we need to look whether the system is able to deliver. We're doing this, for example, with CEPEJ, the indicator development. We have trial monitoring projects on corruption and organized crime cases. We also have advisory missions. So I think this is a very important element that we make sure that the judiciary functions on paper, but also in practice. This does not mean that the governance of the judiciary is not important. It absolutely is. And I think this is an element we need to look at closely. But at the same time, it's not the only thing. It also has the outcome has to work. We have case-based peer review missions. We are planning a new one on high-level corruption and organized crime. We foster regional cooperation. So there's a broad range of tools we can provide to the countries to implement their specific reform needs. We also encourage very much cooperation, international cooperation of the judiciary, in particular on organized crime and smuggling cases, for example. This is why we have proposed to our partner countries to work more with Eurojust. Currently, we have cooperation agreements of Eurojust with Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. And these cooperation agreements provide key tools for the countries to prosecute serious transnational crime. And I think this is also an opportunity to show to member states that the system is working if these investigations deliver concrete results. We are also supporting the involvement of the Western Balkans in the European Judicial Network. We have a long-standing cooperation with the Council of Europe on judiciary matters. Here we have a horizontal facility project for the Western Balkans and also Turkey, which substantially supports judicial reform in these countries. So, yeah, my key message here is judiciary specifically, but rule of law more broadly, is an absolutely core element for the accession negotiations. It's important for the Commission, and I think it's even more important for the member states. So our Western Balkan partners have to deliver in this area. We provide a broad range of support, but we're of course also aware that this is a complex process which takes time. There's steps forwards and sometimes there are also steps back. I think this is part of the game, but I think it's in all of our interest to ensure that we establish judicial systems that are well rooted in society and that provide independent and accountable and efficient justice for all citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nozar. I have immediate hands going up, but I want to react. Thank you very much for giving that overview. Your points are well taken. Of course, the countries need to own their own reforms, and the Commission will provide support and also guidance. With the recent publication, of course, of the enlargement strategy and especially the regular reports on Serbia, the criticism about the Commission being slightly out of touch and its own appreciation of backsliding on rule of law has been noted by many observers. How does the Commission respond to this? Would be my question. Another one would be how does the Commission mobilize its mechanisms to cooperate more with member states, or perhaps coordinate with member states their support in rule of law reforms, just to make sure that indeed they live up to their own commitments made with the revised enlargement methodology, that they would become more engaged, especially on fundamentals. These would be my two questions, but I would give you some time to reflect on that, perhaps, because I know that Fioraba and also Arthur clicked on, I suppose, the outcomes only or also emphasis there.
We don't agree with this, so to put it in a very diplomatic way.
So maybe just to explain ourselves and also the focus on our research. We think that whenever a reform is being implemented, important, it's input legitimacy, the support of citizens. And this is true not only for local reforms, national reforms, but even reforms that are somehow EU-induced through conditionality. So having citizens on our sides is good, both for our countries, but even for the EU. And this is the first element. The so-called output legitimacy, which is, of course, the outcome, is very important, because we are building institutions through taxpayers' money. And we want to show to the society, to our country, that these institutions are worth the cost and all the investment. So outcomes, of course, are very important. But the novelty of our research is that it is a missing bridge between input legitimacy and output legitimacy. And the Albania case shows it perfectly. There was lots of support for the justice reform being done. And this support, as Ardian can further develop, makes us somehow the front runner of the justice reform in all the Western Balkans, I would say. So we know that there are enlargement front runner, as the one you mentioned, Serbia and Montenegro, because they have opened the negotiation chapters before us. But in terms of input legitimacy, it is hard to find a Western Balkan country where all the members of the parliament decided to change 1/3 of their own constitution, only to reform the judiciary. It is hard to find such a political will being embraced not only in deep constitutional revision, but also an entire package of 30 laws and dozens of bylaws to change the system from its fundamentals. And not only that, we created 8 new institutions to govern the judiciary, to ensure accountability, transparency. We revised totally the public prosecutor from centralized to decentralized investigation units, reform in the High Court, Constitutional Court. And this is a costly reform. But if we see only the outcomes, then maybe at this stage, the picture is not something we like. And what happens with justice reform, which is is that sometimes the outcome are not produced in short term, but in long term. And we might lose the legitimacy or somehow bring shadow to the new justice institution and put them in lots of pressure if you focus only on the outcomes. Yeah. And that is why our research wanted somehow to open the discussion with the Commission, but even other stakeholders, to not just stress the outcomes, but the process of building institutions that would survive. I think that we think that the problem we have in the Balkans is that we are building institutions to resolve every problem we have, and this is not efficient. And we are building so many institutions to govern the judiciary, and the point is how long they will survive, because we don't want to come to a certain point where after 5 or 10 years, we revise again the constitution and build up a new institution to govern the judiciary, because it would be a failure. And we don't want this reform to fail. This is why we are trying to focus how to make this institution resilient, to focus on the good governance aspect of it. And in terms of the good governance in Albania, there are lots of good lessons and examples we can draw from the new justice institutions. First of all, they were somehow lately start working. So we always say justice reform in Albania has been there since 2016. There are not so many good outcomes, but we forget that the reform was adopted in 2016, but the institutions start working relatively late. The first institution started working, the vetting institution started working only 1 year after the reform was adopted. The High Judicial Council, High Prosecutorial Council start working 22 months later. The High Justice Inspector started working in 2020, 4 years after, at least or less. And nowadays we're talking about anti-corruption and catching the big fish. But the NBI, the National Bureau of Investigation, which is the supporting arm of the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office, is still recruiting its members. Is still in the process of recruiting 30 members, which is half of the capacity they have so far. And that's why we think it's important to see how this institution have operated. They started late, but what we have seen in our research is the leaders have committed to catch all the time lost in the implementation of the reform. And this is a good example of leadership. We have seen leaders being engaged themselves in the administration of the institution, not only from the legal level, but also from the organizational level, despite their managerial profile, because they are all lawyers. We have seen institution noticed by an adapted governance. Why? Because the institution didn't set up some objectives and abide formally, but although they were very young, they were trying to govern in a way that would save the negative aspect that the vetting was causing to the judiciary. So every new justice institution was trying to govern in a shifting ground where situations were changing very fast due to vetting, and they had to take immediate measure to respond to the needs of the system. Then this makes them not only formal institution, but institutions that really put lots of energy to govern and to respond to the needs. And more importantly, we have seen that in all their decision making, before making a decision which had an impact on the system, they were careful to draft the bylaws, to put the standards, to put criteria which were transparent and meritocratic. And they are building in such a tradition of good governance by establishing a professional ethos. And this is something we need to appreciate in the work of the new institution. They have been also active.
Can I interrupt you a little bit, because we can come back to you in a moment, but I wanted to hear also from Arthur on this specific point.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I would have only 4 short comments. First of all, the justice reform in Albania has been going on for a few years now, and we still don't have a photograph of the performance of the new justice institutions. In a meaning that we have to agree on a joint understanding of the word good performance or non-good performance. And in order to have such a photography, you need to establish a methodology of evaluating the performance of the justice institutions based on scientific and analytical indicators. The second comment I have is that the justice reform in Albania has been very deep. And to be frank, also traumatic to the Albanian society, because we are now suffering the effects of such a reform. By this, I don't mean that it was a not good thing. It was the best thing that it happened to the country, the reform, I mean. But we have to appreciate this sacrifice that the society is making in Albania. If we keep appreciating by putting new rules, I don't think we go to the right direction. We just delay the successor of the reform, because I share another opinion by from the colleagues that I don't have any doubts that the reform will be successful. When? It's another thing. And of course, I don't think everybody or you expect that we shall have the successor of the reform in the next 2 or 3 years. The reform will be effective at least after a decade. But we have to appreciate things step by step by not putting only new rules. The third thing is that in order to have a successful justice reform, it cannot be separated by the development of other dimensions or other parts of the society. We need to democratize all the society in Albania. And in order to do this, you do it, or the best way to do it is by the integration process. We cannot do it by online meetings or trainings. We just do by face-to-face meetings and exchange and cultures, views, and projects, ideas, how to develop things together. By this, I go to the idea that probably the stages of the European Union are a bit longer, but we can go to another way, like Ardian likes to call it, the institutional connectivity. The more contacts the institutions have in Albania with their homologues or other partners in European Union countries or structures, the better it is for the reform in itself, but also for the development of the country, of the region, and also the European Union itself.
Yeah, I click on this particular point, which was, of course, mentioned by Mr. Nozar, and I think we owe you, of course, a right of response here. You mentioned the involvement in the European Justice Training Network. There's a question actually also about perhaps phasing in early participation of candidate countries, certainly those negotiating, into EPPO, the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Perhaps you could respond to that as well. But floor is yours. Some responses, reactions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, broad range of comments. I mean, first of all, let me be absolutely clear. I fully agree with you that we need to take into account what Albania has achieved through its reform process. It was a very bold reform, and I'm not saying we are not taking this into account. I'm just saying, yes, we appreciate this reform process. We are monitoring it closely. We have assessed it in our annual reports every year, and I think it has received a very positive description there, exactly because it was such a bold reform process, and we also believe that it will work. I'm just saying, at the end of the process, at some point, we also, of course, have to see the output. So I think you cannot replace one by the other. This is all that I wanted to say here. Let me also say a couple of words on our annual reports. I mean, there's often criticism that we're too positive or too negative, depending on which perspective you're coming from. But we, from the Commission, we consult a very broad range of sources. We consult our experts in-house, our delegations on the ground. We consult a broad range of international organizations. Of course, we get input from the countries. We consult civil society and NGOs. So we really try to establish the broadest possible picture to get a solid assessment. And especially with the revised methodology, we are also trying to bring in the member states. We are consulting them on the ground, but also centrally from Brussels. So I do think that our reports give a relatively accurate picture of the situation. Of course, you can always discuss on specific details, but I think it is a solid product that reflects the situation in the countries. On the European Public Prosecutor's Office, I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm not an expert on this specific institution, so I don't know where exactly we stand. But the more we can bring the Western Balkans into the procedures and the institutions of the European Union, the better. And this was clearly said also in the revised methodology with the accelerated integration idea, that we want to bring the Western Balkans already as close as possible to the EU before accession, and not always wait for this point somewhere in the future when suddenly with accession you get everything, but make it more gradual and already see the citizens before the actual accession that there are a lot of benefits in joining the EU. So this is a crucial point. Last point, involvement of the member states. I mean, the revised methodology has clearly proposed that we want to bring them in more. One element was, of course, the consultations for the annual reports. But also, if you look at the political IGCs, the intergovernmental conferences, we held the first of these political IGCs, which are not just about opening and closing of chapters or clusters. We held the first of these with Serbia and Montenegro in the summer. And I think this was a very good exercise to allow the member states and the national authorities to exchange directly and see what are the priorities on the one side, what are the priorities and possibly the difficulties on the other side. And I think this political exchange is absolutely crucial to bring the process forward.
Just, well, I'm really glad that some keywords are kind of popping up in this discussion, like good governance, resilience, and also the legitimacy, which is increasing important. And I would just profit from this opportunity just to add another comment on the importance of what we call throughput legitimacy, or the way the new institutions work as compared with the outcomes that we expect from them. The problem or the challenge is that the outcomes, they can somehow be masked through the technical assistance or external consultants, basically. And also, if they are masked, we tend not to see the problem with the legitimacy of the institutions, and this brings this kind of dichotomy between what the Commission says and what the member countries decide, but the Council decides, like in the case of Albania, when the Commission said Albania is okay, but the Bundestag added another 9 conditions that had to do with the input legitimacy, with the way those institutions were created and were functioning, and also. I believe that increasing the good governance, the focus and the assistance of the good governance of the institutions also helps their resilience. And it was the Minister Maricis that brought the resilience in it. So, I mean, I fully agree with Mr. Nozer. I mean, outcomes at some point, they need to be there, because why did we brought the institutions? But to make sure that there is no reversibility, we need to make sure that those institutions, which are the outcomes for excellence of the reforms, need to be there and need to have a lot of attention and a lot of resources. We need to we have used the term cordon sanitaire around them. There is a question about expectations about chapter 23 and 24 and how they can be reflected in the rest of the chapters. We believe that the chapter 23 and 24 in the fundamentals are not yet mainstreamed into the other chapters, which is reflected in the last country reports when we still, let's say, measure the progress chapter by chapter. But we do not see how, I don't know, chapter 12 or 17, etc., has taken into account the progress done on justice reform and the corruption. We do not assess or evaluate how the quality of justice, how the corruption phenomena impacts the progress in the other chapters. We believe that it is not an easy exercise, but we believe that focusing on the good governance of the institutions in each chapter makes possible to mainstream and to embed the fundamentals. And when I mean, in all the chapters and not only in the cluster. So basically, when we talk about the procurement, you mentioned it, management of public management, etc., we are talking about good governance. And if the institutions in all the 20, 34 or 35, whatever chapters are well governed, it will be a very good indicator or benchmark that the fundamentals cluster is being properly implemented. So this was my kind of reply to the anonymous family.
Thank you very much, Ardian. Erwan Fouere, the former USR and head of Commission delegation, very double-hatted EU official in that respect, to Skopje, and now associate senior fellow here at CEPS, asks whether they're optimistic that the new approaches have seen a change in public confidence of citizens in due process and functioning of the rule of law. Maybe that's a question I can pose first to you, Bojan, but also to Albe and Artur.
Can you read it once again?
Well, all the innovations in justice sector reform that has been implemented over the years, has it actually led to a change in public confidence of citizens in due process and the functioning of the rule of law?
Well, certainly yes, but probably not enough. I mean, what happened in the past 5 to 6 years, at least in North Macedonia, has demonstrated that it's possible to have high-level corruption cases or big fish in front of the court. But I think that what people still cannot feel is improvement on a daily basis in the daily business of the courts. There are a lot of people who are facing long-standing trials or disputes that take place for 15 years. They make the circle of first instance, second instance, Supreme Court a couple of times, and this is killing the credibility and let's say the narrative that we are doing something about improving the judiciary. So I think the answer is certainly yes, but it's not enough.
One of the goals of the justice reform in Albania was exactly to turn the confidence of the citizens to the judiciary, and this was the main goal of the justice reform. And this was not just a goal. The justice reform in Albania has specific legal provision how to include citizens in the judicial reform. And I think this is an innovation because citizens legally can participate somehow in certain aspect of the work of the new justice institution. And how? A few examples. For example, vetting, the so famous process that is happening in Albania, has specific provisions how citizens can be collaborators in the justice reform. There is a specific article in the vetting law calling about collaborators. And these are citizens who were victims of an unfair process, who somehow have allegations about judges being corrupted or having a certain misconduct. And they collaborate with the justice institution by bringing this decision to the vetting body. On the other hand, scrutinize the decisions and calls the vetting assessee to respond why he did not follow the law, what were his main considerations when judging, and somehow making, for the first time, judges accountable directly to the citizen, which I think is very novel. It's hard to find a place somewhere of this process. And when I see the number of people going to the vetting bodies, presenting their court decision, some have standing grounds, legal grounds, I might have not, but I see and I read it as a confidence in the new institution. Especially also the statistics nearby the high justice inspector show the citizens are somehow prone to cooperate and have a basic trust in the new institution. And the high justice inspector is an example of the number of petitions from citizens going there. On the other hand, I really could not agree more with Minister of Macedonia saying that there is also this negative aspect. of course, being postponed or even pending due to the vetting process. We have this situation in Albania where Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court did not work for 2 years. The Appellate Court had half of the justice and judges they should have because of the vetting. And the removal of judges from the system is causing problems in handling specific cases. And of course, this brings frustration. But on the other hand, it is a cost that we're having as a society. And also the one who have cases into courts are somehow perceiving this cost, but they would prefer to have a judge that would abide to the law, will not be corrupted, will interpret the law and render justice, rather than being influenced by unethical or proper actors. So yes, there is a difficult and complex period we're living. It's not easy because, as it was mentioned in this table, the justice reform in Albania is shocking and has shocked all systems. But there is a positive trend, and we need to nourish it. How? This is my last comment in here, by communicating better. The justice reform started in 2016, but only lately, like 1 year ago, the Ministry of Justice in Albania started to ask for some technical assistance from EU for communication. And as we were discussing with Adrian, the communication so far, the justice reform is being done by policymakers, by politicians, and not exactly somehow reflecting the new judicial institution position. So we need to communicate better the reform. We need to give the voice to the new institution and help them to draft their own strategic communication with the citizen. And maybe there is this room from some other technical assistant. Every new justice institution needs to have some communication strategy and have some assistance in that. And also, the third, we need to support the civil society to monitor the justice reform and to communicate it. Because politicians make the justice institution, we know, part of their political game, and this is what we expect from politicians. But we need some independent voices who monitor the justice institution and communicate to the citizens, to the lay members of the society, what's happening. And this is some room for improvement that, of course, would somehow help building trust in the institution and also building their legitimacy.
Thank you very much, Faraba. Did you want to say something still on this particular point, Arthur? Because you have a communication strategy to follow probably as well. Explain your job.
Yes, it's a tough question, to be frank, because I mean, the justice reform in Albania is probably one of the single reforms that had the most public support. I mean, not only the 140 votes of the parliament, full unanimity, but also the support of the Albanian society, because they felt the need for change in the justice reform. And that hope and that feeling still is present in the society, but it is being substituted by frustration. It is being substituted by frustration because the delays of the establishment of our institutions, the problems that the reform has brought, and their normal effects of the reform. But also to stress the fact that we need to be present with the publication of our activity, to be transparent with our activity. But also, I insist on the fact that the EU should be transparent in publishing the indicators, how they evaluate the process in Albania, because people need to know what the guys in Albania are doing and how they are perceived in the EU, because why did we make such a sacrifice? And they all go together. That's why I insist on the fact that we have to be step by step evaluating the process, appreciating the process, and also creating new standards for the future in order to increase the hopes of the society and the expectations of the society where they should be, and answering to these expectations.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I know, Bojan, that you have to leave. You have a crisis, no doubt, on your hand with this terrible bus crash in Bulgaria, where 45 citizens of your country died. Our collective condolences, of course. with the people of North Macedonia in this particular case. I know that Elga, you wanted to come in. Can you just limit it to a Twitter length key takeaway?
Well, I'm just bringing something on the table which could be a good reason to come back again, because apparently there is too much to talk about, and also there is a lot of interest. And that is building on the comments that some of the panelists made on the increasing transparency. Judges and prosecutors, all because of their long mandate, independency, etc., do not show to be very interested in being open with media or accountability. Let me tell you that the Dutch, again, confirm here their engagement. We are working with the Albanian judiciary bodies, new bodies with for the press judge, because we have to also build communication skills in-house. And before doing that, there is a whole challenge of opening up the mentality, the mindset. But maybe this is something that we can follow up with another webinar, because we will still be there with the press judge concept, which is now being landed in Albania. And I hope it will be fertile. It will land in fertile land. So thank you so much.
Elga, there's a side discussion still going on the point of the Commission's appreciation of rule of law in Serbia, perhaps. It's directly addressed to you, Mr. Nozar. Perhaps you could still react to that point.
Yes, sure. I mean, actually, I have already reacted, and I think I have answered the question. If you feel that this is not specific enough, or you have heard that before, well, you have heard that before because it's simply true. We do have a broad basis for our reports. They are broadly consulted with all our experts in-house. They are adopted, at least the communication and the reports as annexes by the college. So we stand behind our reports. Now, as I said, you can always discuss, and I'm happy to engage with you bilaterally in more of a discussion. But I think the reports are very solid documents which very well represent the situation in the countries. The fact that we always get criticized for this or that from one side or the other side, sometimes it's too positive, too negative, just shows that these are difficult topics. But I think the Commission brings an objective assessment to the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nozar. No doubt this discussion will continue between the Commission and the European Parliament. Albe, thanks for your interventions there too. We're conscious again of the noise that is happening with a sensitive microphone. Apologies for some of the background noise to our online audience. I would like to wrap it up before this disintegrates even further on our side, but not before I would warmly thank on behalf of the audience, the two organizing institutions, SEPS, and especially, of course, CDI in Tirana, for all of your participation, for coming to Brussels, for sharing your experiences, your analysis, insights, and opinions. Thank you to our audience for your interventions, your questions, and we hope that you will stay tuned for further events that we'll be organizing and co-organizing in the future on this topic. Thank you very much, and we wish you still a nice day.
Thank you.